This slideshow will help you after you've read the article by Richard Lee, Eating Christmas. The article was written both to teach us about the Kung, and I'll explain their voices in a minute, and about anthropological follies. So please click and go to the next slide. Kung live in the Kalahari Desert, which is in part South Africa, Botswana, and Namibia. Now, they haven't always lived there, but I wanted you to see this because I want you to sense the isolation that they live in and the barren countryside. Please click. The Kung are a gathering and hunting society, not hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering was a term made out when there was mostly males in the field. But once women got there, we learned that actually women did most of the work. Hunting was glorified, but gathering is where the bread came from. And this is not your standard desert, the Kalahari. In the wet season, there's 23 water holes, and in the dry season, 7. Now, unlike other areas, it's not the same 7 each season. So the Kung have reached an elaborate kinship pattern. So basically, everyone is related to everyone. So they all have rights to the water holes. Now, we talked in the goals for the week about environmental determinism. So what the Kalahari environment influenced was that the Kung would have to be cooperative. There's a similar circumstances in Australia among the Ainu, where traditionally they fought every year for the same scarce resources. The Kung are nomadic, which means they don't stay in one place for more than a few days because they gather what's available in an area, or they hunt what the men could catch, which is usually nothing in the same area, and then they're forced to move on. They gather nuts, berries, and gourds, and they have memories. They remember where these things were buried from previous years. When they do hunt, it's for elephants, giraffes, lions, and leopards. But again, the hunting is not nearly as successful as the gathering, and the women are therefore more successful than the men in keeping the society alive. Please click. The Kung, or as they call themselves, the San people, have probably lived in this area for 400,000 years. Their language is certainly 400,000 years old. And the way anthropologists trace this is they see how much of the language is consistent with people living in the area and how much has been spread out around them. Now, the click actually comes from hunting. When you watch the little video of The Gods Must Be Crazy, you heard clicking noises. That's because when they hunted, they made the sounds of animals in order not to spook the animals, but as a way to communicate with each other. They've only lived in the Kalahari for about 20,000 years. They were actually shoved into there by other groups. And there's rock paintings that demonstrate how old they are, how long they've been there. And actually, if you look at the paintings, you see human figures. And this is pretty typical that hunters would paint the hunt before they actually did the hunt in order to control the spirits of the animals. Their technology is not very complex. Ostrich eggs for carrying water, branches to build huts, sticks to dig with, poison arrows, and in the movie you saw a bottle of Coke. Please click. Now, although Richard Lee plays the fool in the article you read, he actually is probably the main reason that the Kung still exists today. They're threatened from all sides, and one of the things he did is bring the world's attention to the plight of the Kung. Among the threats are cattle. Farmers now have put up fences which interfere with their nomadic way of life and the game that they might normally hunt. They've also had their water holes poisoned in a way to get rid of them. Yes, ethnic cleansing. There's been poachers coming in with rifles to steal their game, starvation. They've been treated as second-class citizens, and in the 19th century and early 20th century, there were even bounties on their head. They've been forced to relocate within the Kalahari Desert, and most recently, diamonds have been found in this area, posing a further threat to their way of life. Please click and go to the next slide. The event that is the central piece of this article is the final Christmas that Richard Lee spent in the Kalahari. But it was the accumulation of 3 years of field work. He was there to study subsistence patterns. That is, how much energy did it take for the Kung to survive living their traditional lives? And here's something to think about. When you graduate, you're going to have to work a minimum of 35 or 40 hours a week, probably much more. The Kung work a maximum of maybe 14 hours. But still, Lee angered the Kung because he would not give them food, only tobacco and medicine. And as the reason for that, if he gave them food, in fact, they wouldn't do what he was there to study. Now, Christmas to the Kung is the study of the white man's God chief. There's a feast where all the various groups, or what they call bands, come together, trading, gathering, marriage, and trance dancing. Please click and go to the next slide to see what this trance dancing looks like. Pot started. Woo! Anyhow, Lee's fieldwork actually lasted for 3 years. At a very minimum, fieldwork should be 1 year, because that way you get all the 4 seasons. However, increasingly, funding is harder to get to do that. And you'll see the timing of the year matters, and you'll see that in the next article you read by Bohannon. Most of what Lee did was participant observation. He went on the hunts with the men and really was involved, and he learned the language too. He also had key informants, and it's very important for you to understand the relationship of these informants to the Kung community, because they were not everyday Kung. They had special qualities about them. Now, he would trade tobacco and medicine for information, but as I said earlier, he would not trade food because that would destroy what he was studying. So he lived, compared to them, fairly well. So they thought of him a bit of as a miser. But one of the things you should think about for your assignment, they were both sad that he was leaving and glad that he was leaving. So please go to the next slide. Long story short, Lee got what he thought was a huge ox for this final farewell feast. And he looked at its size, when he got it, and why are very important. But equally important, the feedback that he got from the various Kung and his own wife, soon to be his ex-wife, Nancy, were very insightful to the culture of the Kung. And I want you to pay very close attention to what they said to him about this ox as you read the article. Now, the Kung had pretty much convinced Lee that this ox was skinny, was useless. They would have fighting over the scarceness of the meat. But they had actually knew all along that this was a big ox. There were white layers of fat, and in fact, 3 layers of fat. And when the ox was finally slaughtered, they burst out laughing. They had played a joke on him. And they had 2 days of dancing and feasting, cooked 14 pots of beef, which is about 50 pounds per person, and there were no fights. Please click. Now click again. So the joke was on Lee, but it wasn't a random joke. It was a joke to teach him a very specific lesson, which I'll get to on the last slide. But it's also very important to understand who his informants were, and how his story might have been different had he chosen different informants. They were all male, but they all had distinct characteristics. There's no way I'm going to pronounce this word, but his first informant, Kakakus, was a Twanza. He wasn't even a Kung. He had married into the group, so he was an outsider. The next one, Ula, had killed somebody with a spear. And that's very, very unique for the Kung. It was the only act of violence that any anthropologist has observed in over 50 years of study. Tomaso was a trance dancer, and then Lingzi was another Twanza. So these were not mainstream Kung. And again, this is important to understand because he was selecting people who, like himself, were on the outside. Please click and go to the final slide. Why did the Kung go to so much trouble to teach Lee a lesson? Read his speech at the end and what each of his informants tried to tell him about why there was such a joke. Okay. For the Kung to survive, no one could feel better than the others because they lived in a situation of reciprocity where everybody had to depend on everybody else through social obligation in order to survive. And that was really important. Humility was the key to survival. And they felt Lee was not humble. Lee said then, well, why didn't you tell me this? Please click. Because you never ask. That's right. Anthropologists have to ask the right questions.